Okay, we're going to start with a video. Fingers crossed it plays. Sound. The Agile mindset is described by the 4 values of the Agile Manifesto, supported by the 12 principles behind it. Agile is implemented by an almost unlimited number of practices: Scrum, Kanban, XP, TDD, user stories. The list goes on. With all of these practices, with all of these different behaviours and values in different parts of the world, can we really say that all teams practicing Agile comes back to the Agile mindset? And this is what I'm here to talk about today. How does culture impact Agile adoption? Are some cultures more naturally suited to adopting Agile than others? Is there such a thing as an Agile culture that emerges whenever a company or a team adopts Agile? Do underlying behaviours prevail, as we saw in that video? So my name's David Spinks. This is my partner, Claudia Califano. I've worked with Agile team since 2012. Presently, I work as a freelance Scrum Master, Agile coach, and lately got involved in training. So I train Kanban with Lean Kanban University. Both of us also train IC Agile courses. We also give some DevOps training and cross-cultural training. At the beginning of 2018, we began a journey. We wanted to answer this question: what impact does culture have on Agile adoption? We started looking online and we saw statements such as, you can't do Agile in China, or Scrum doesn't work in Germany. So we thought, well, let's go and see for ourselves. We hadn't seen anybody actually go out and do the research. Here's some of the pictures of the people that we met on our journey. We traveled for 8 months. So 3 months through South America, through countries such as Argentina, Colombia, Chile, and Uruguay. And then we went to Asia. We went through Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore, Japan, among some others. And when we got back, we spent some time going around Europe. So what I'm going to talk about today is why we think this is important. Why does thinking about culture matter? What happens when cultures collide? I'm going to talk a little bit about some models for categorizing culture. A big part of this stuff is how we communicate. So we'll talk about some communication patterns, and then why this is important for diverse teams, give you some hints and tips on that, and then we'll sum up and I'll give you some takeaways. So let's kick off. What happens when cultures collide?
I didn't know Springfield had a Russian district. Excuse me, can you tell me how to get into the museum?
You are asking a question about the game. You think the game was like you are saying?
No, that's not what I said. I didn't say what I think. I'm asking you what you think. I'm sorry. That's just what I'm asking.
I'm sorry to say, but it's a silly question. When the team cross the midfield line once in 90 minutes, and the other team is for 90 minutes with the ball in the opponent half, trying, you are telling me that one team cancelled the other one and each other. We didn't have to defend. We didn't defend. We had the ball all the time, and David Herrera was sleeping, and because he was sleeping, he made that funny thing. I was laughing with that funny thing because it's the only way to react to that.
So that's quite typical of Jose Mourinho there. You could see at the beginning, very angry, very open with his body language, very emotional, and he went into this long ramble while the English interviewer was getting really flustered. So interesting interaction there. So when we have misunderstandings, a lot of the time it's down to cultural differences. And if we're going to get high-performing teams, highly performing organizations, we need to start to understand each other culturally. But what do we actually mean by culture? So let's step back a little bit and explore that. So it's not just our nationality. Different regions within different nations will have different cultures. Indonesia, for example, is made up of thousands of islands, with hundreds of different subcultures just in this one country. Our professional and education background, our gender, our political beliefs, our class, our religious beliefs, generational differences, all of these things feed into what makes our culture as individuals. We talk a lot in Agile about corporate culture, yet corporate culture is made up of the people. The people feed into that corporate culture. So with all of these different layers, looking for some tools to help us understand different cultural models, different ways of categorizing culture. So let's look at that next. There's been lots of work in this area by various sociologists. Gert Hofstede is probably one of the more famous ones. Anybody heard of him? No? Okay. So Gert Hofstede came up with a model. It was based on 6 dimensions, and it was quantitative measures on these different characteristics, and he compared different nations that way. There's other work by the likes of Frans Tampenaars and Charles Hampton Turner. But in our research, we were drawn to a guy called Richard D. Lewis, and he's written several books on the subject. This one, Fish Can't See Water, it's about how within our culture, we're kind of stuck within our goldfish bowl. We can't see out beyond our own culture. The main one that we focused on was this one, When Cultures Collide. It sold more than 1 million copies worldwide. It's based on his work traveling to more than 130 countries, and he spent significant time working in 20 of those. He gathered his data through a series of surveys and observations. I think it was something like 150,000 surveys that his research was based on. So what Lewis found was, when we look at all of these different factors that feed into what is culture, human behavior actually fits into 3 categories. He wanted to create a much more simple model that managers could work with. So he created these categories: linear active, multi-active, and reactive. We're going to go into some of the detail of these behaviours as we go, but just to give you a feel for them, linear active are people that are very logical, plan things step by step, like to work on things one thing at a time. Multi-active people, very emotional, they're very outward with their feelings. They're comfortable multitasking. They're very talkative. Reactive people, they're great listeners, absorbing what is being said, what's being done. Ceremony and harmony is really important to the reactive group. So what Lewis did was take his categories and he created a visual representation here. And what he's done is take each of these categories on 3 points of this triangle, and he's mapped different nations depending on how strongly they exhibit behaviours in each of these categories. It's important to note that no one group is going to be completely dominant. There's always going to be behaviours from the other two. It's just a question of how much. So as you can see, UK is down here, very strongly linear active, as well as other parts of Europe, so the likes of Germany, Switzerland, Luxembourg, also US. At the top, we've got a multi-active category. These are countries that are largely Latino, so South America, Italy, Spain, plus also parts of sub-Saharan Africa. On the bottom right-hand side, we've got the reactive group, largely those countries in the Far East, so China, Vietnam, Japan. Now, there's a danger here of stereotyping nations, but this becomes a useful tool. There's actually a test that can be done to see whereabouts on this triangle you fit. I'm actually down here somewhere. My partner Claudia, she's up there, so we have interesting conversations sometimes. But this becomes a useful tool. So for example, if I'm hiring a sales manager for my China office, and I've got a great candidate in front of me, and I get him to do this test, and he scores highly multi-active, I might place him in my Colombia office instead of my China office, for example. So with this tool, we can start managing cross-culturally. So what does this mean for Agile? So let's focus on some of these behaviours and compare this to some of our observations from our travels. So as a reminder, the linear active group, people that are very factual, we believe truth can be derived from data and facts. Timelines are very important, sticking to deadlines, sticking to set times for things. Laws and institutions are really important to this group. So what did we see? Well, we saw a clear separation between people's social lives and their professional lives. Yeah, people would go for a drink after work, but they weren't as entwined socially as perhaps we saw in other parts of the world. By nature, more transactional, so buying, selling, going to work for a contract, giving something and getting something back. Those sorts of relationships are more abundant in linear active behaviour. A lot of use of detailed planning and metrics. So we're used to seeing projects with 3-month, 6-month, 1-year plans ahead. Lots of use of metrics such as tracking velocity, how many features have been completed, end of sprint reports. It's quite common in linear active companies and organisations. More individualism. So people tend to like to work in silos a bit more. From my experience as an Agile coach, it's been quite demanding trying to get people to pair together or share knowledge in some of these linear active situations. Also, the way that companies reward people. We do annual appraisals to people as individuals rather than as teams. Really good on focusing on deadlines and getting items to market. Setting a deadline and getting it done is a linear active strength. And I mentioned there's an expectation that there's rules to be followed. So not just corporate rules, but following the mechanics of something like Scrum. So teams are really good at saying, right, our stand-up must be within 15 minutes and be at the same time every day, doing the mechanics really well. Maybe not understanding why behind it, but following the rules. So it's interesting that a lot of the linear active economies are based on the Tayloristic management structures, very hierarchical, top-down control. And we think this is a bit of a challenge nowadays. If you think the likes of Europe and the US boomed during the manufacturing era, where the work was in the complicated domain. I'm not going to go into connecting too much here, but hopefully you know what I mean by complicated. It's difficult work, but it's repeatable. You do the same thing, you're going to get the same result. So we think there's a bit of a challenge for linear active countries because the companies are set up in this Tayloristic way. Are they really suited to knowledge work? True empowerment that comes with Agile. One of our other observations was the stability of teams. We don't see teams staying together long. People move job a lot. Compare this to a country like Japan. In Japan, people will move job once or twice in their whole career. Whereas in countries like UK or Australia, people move around maybe once a year or every 2 years. So it means that the Agile teams aren't staying together for a long period of time. They're not building up to those high-performing states. They're not getting that stability. Also, from a management point of view, people are seen as resources, almost interchangeable. There isn't that sort of mindset of building really high-performing teams by keeping people together and actually getting to levels of high performance. There is one pattern that has been emerging, though. We saw this in a consultancy down in London, also in another one in Singapore. So 2 different companies came up with the same model. And we're calling them pop-up teams. And this is where the consultancy form a team, can be made up of contractors or permanent people, but the idea is that they keep that team together from client to client. So one client engagement finishes, and then they get moved on to the next one. So it's a win-win for everybody. So the new client gets a team that's already formed, they've gone through that formation period, they know how to work together. And the people working in the team feel like they belong to something, yet they can keep their independence as contractors. So perhaps this is a model that will become more common going forward. Let's talk about the multi-active behaviours now and observations. So as a reminder, these are the countries in Latin America, also Mediterranean, so Italy, Spain, and some parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Here, values are much more based on family, on friendship, on building relationships. Here, truth is seen much more in how it's negotiated, on people's charisma, how people are persuaded. It's not about facts and figures so much. So what did we see? We saw much more socially and professionally intertwined lives. People's workmates were their colleagues. People's colleagues were also their friends outside of work. One example of this was a company in Uruguay, a software house, and the company had actually empowered a team to say, right, here's your available money for the year for pay rises, and you guys decide within you. So the team were empowered to decide who got what. So they went through different ideas of how they would do this. One of the things that they actually said to us was, if John is expecting a baby, or his wife, or his house burns down, then of course we would award him his money. They were so close with each other, they were looking out for each other on a personal note as well. So very relationship driven, not just within teams, but across the whole society. So for software vendors, it was important to build really good relationships with clients for the long term. It wasn't just about winning the short-term deal. More and more, we saw companies and heard stories where the vendor would refuse to work with a particular client because the team didn't feel comfortable working with them. It was much more important for them to keep their team happy than to win the next sale. Much more lightweight use of planning and metrics. So we'd ask, how are you measuring your progress? Where's your planning? And a lot of the time in South America, the team would turn around and point to the wall, and that was it. There was a user story map, and that acted as their plan, their progress, their metrics, everything. There was very little use of things like velocity or story points. And then we asked about how you measure success. again, from a linear active background, I'm used to, we delivered 100 points or 20 features this year. These guys were saying, well, we base it on customer feedback. One of the best answers we had was a company in Colombia, and they said, we measure our success by the size of the smile on our customer's face, which we thought was great. They're really good at seeing the big picture, so they don't get stuck in the details too much. They're always questioning why we're doing things. They're looking at what is the goal that we're trying to achieve. Back to building that relationship, we're doing things for the customer. So very questioning, as I say. So not just of requirements, but of everything they do, of agile processes themselves. They're willing to experiment. We met many teams that had ditched the daily stand-up because they felt that the communication was good enough that they didn't need it. Other teams doing Nexus that had changed the frequency of their meetings in contradiction to the guide because they were adapting to what suited them. These guys are very talkative though, very verbose, rich use of language. So there can be a tendency to lose focus. We sat in a few sprint planning meetings. So it requires really strong facilitation skills, really strong scrum masters to keep things on track and stick to the time boxes with the multi-active cultures. So I want to delve into a little bit more about this relationship-driven side. It's not a presentation without a Dilbert cartoon. Perhaps many of you have been in this situation where a contract has taken a long time to actually come to fruition. Time goes by while a document is prepared, legal people have to get involved, we have to make sure that governance processes are there. Everything has been covered in the final contract before it gets signed off. We met one company in Chile, and they showed us how they did contracts with their smaller clients. They couldn't do this with government or the really big companies, but they ditched contracts. They were going with what they were calling working agreements. And what this was an agreement how they as a vendor were going to work with the client. And this included clauses like the client must provide a product owner that must be available to the team for 50% of the time. Or the product owner reserves the right to change the order of the work as long as it's not been started, while the team had the right to re-estimate work as they learned. So really cool stuff. There was nothing in there about scope. Okay? Here's actually an example of a real contract. It's just 10 pages long. So it includes the high-level agreements. Even there's pages such as this is the team, this is the development tools, this is how we're going to collaborate with each other. And a very high-level plan. So no fixed budget. They'd agree a price. You get this many sprints for that. Off you go. Let's see what we can discover. So really cool stuff they were doing. I mentioned real emphasis on building what the customer wants. Another example was a large multinational financial institution based in Santiago. And you think, a company that size, they won't really be agile. But what they did was they had teams completely empowered. We visited their mobile team, and they were building applications, proofs of concepts. And rather than having to go through layers of bureaucracy to get this software into an end user's hands, they were taking it down themselves to the local coffee shop and testing it with real users. So, and this is in, like I say, a real large financial institution. They were really focusing on building what the customer wants, not what the bank thought they wanted. And they were given freedom to do that. So really cool stuff. Let's talk about some of the reactives now. So as a reminder, reactives are the countries in the Far East. So countries such as China, Japan, Vietnam, Indonesia. So here, the mindset is a bit different. Reactives don't see truth is something that's absolute, or time as something that's absolute. To them, time is cyclic. The sun rises and it sets. Generations come and go. The stock markets rise and fall. You can't control time, and there's no absolute truth in things. So they're very considered. in their decision-making process. They take a lot of time to mull things over because you can't control things in that way. A big part of their culture, again, is harmony and courtesy. So what do we see? Again, very socially and professionally intertwined lives. Very relationship-driven again. Very highly collaborative. We probably saw the best team working in reactive countries, better than anywhere else. Must not lose face. So this is a really important part of the reactive culture. It's really important for reactive people not to feel embarrassed, to cause embarrassment to other people or feel embarrassed themselves. There's a bit of a stereotype when working with Asian people saying, are you going to deliver this piece of software and this time? And they always say yes. No is not in their vocabulary. But this is about saving face. It's actually going to cause them embarrassment, or it could cause you embarrassment by saying no. So by asking that question in that way puts them in a really awkward position. So just being aware of these cultural differences means that we can start to change the language that we use. So instead of asking that question in that way, we can say, when do you think this piece of software is going to be ready? So that changes the whole dynamic. Companies tend to be really hierarchical in reactive countries, layers of management. And yet, decisions are done by consensus. They want everybody on board. They want the whole company pointing in the right direction. So although they're very hierarchical, they want that buy-in. They want everybody working together towards the common goal. Status is really important in reactive cultures. Earning certificates, qualifications, getting to a management position. In Singapore, everybody wants to be a manager. Not because they want to be a manager, but because they want that status symbol. Being a developer is actually seen as low-level manufacturing work. People don't really want to do it. They see it as low-skilled. They don't see it as a status symbol. But that's beginning to change now as they realize that it's actually a really highly skilled job. So that is changing. So let's delve into a little bit more. I'm going to focus on a few observations from Japan. So I talked about how great reactive people are as collaborators. So all over Japan, and at least 3 companies that we visited, we saw mob programming as a common technique. I don't know about you, but in my time, I've had a challenge just persuading senior managers to let teams pair program, let alone mob program. So this is where the whole mob stations have been set up, where the whole team, product owner and all, sitting around one screen, working on one feature together. And this is a common practice. Other elements of team working. So Japan is famous for its long working hours. That's not just management pressure, but that's peer pressure as well. If one person stays late, the whole team stays late. They're all helping each other out, working through. I must point out at this point that this is a stock image. So I apologize for the lack of cultural representation of Japan in this picture. Okay, so I'm going to talk about another concept. So I talked about that decision by consensus. And again, this is a common trait of reactive culture. And it's quite extreme in Japan. And there's actually a term for it called nemawashi, which I think originated from Toyota. And this is where decisions are come up with through corridor conversations, through chats at the water cooler. Nemawashi basically translates as preparing the soil. Formal meetings are not where the decisions are made. They're made outside. I talked about ceremony a lot earlier. So meetings are more ceremonial. If you've ever been to Japan, you have to do the whole business card thing where you hand over your business card, you study it, and you look at it really seriously. Then you do the whole ceremonial thing. Those formal meetings aren't about the content. That happens outside of it, and that's part of what nemawashi is. So it does mean that decisions take a long time to be made because you've got to build this consensus. So it's interesting that a lot of agile ideas came from the Toyota production system, from the original paper the new product development game, which inspired Jeff Sutherland and Ken Schwaber. And yet, Agile adoption in Japan is really low compared to US and Europe. And Nemawashi could be one reason for this. It's not culturally fit for them. Scrum Inc., this is Jeff Sutherland's company. They were out there when we were out there. And they're doing a lot of work in Japan. They're really pushing Scrum in Japan now. They're working with several companies. So it's really interesting to see where that's going to go. So it could be that the product owner role, when taken seriously in Japan, could actually transform them. If you know much about Japan, you'll know that they've been in a period of stagnation for the last couple of decades. And part of that is because we've moved into knowledge work, and the Japanese culture hasn't adopted to that. They're still in that manufacturing mindset. So it's interesting to see if Scrum and Agile is going to have an impact on that, if they can adopt it. Another Japanese term, honotatame. So hone basically means the true sound. Tatame is the facade. What this is talking about is our true feelings, our emotions are kept internal. We only share them with our true friends, our close family. And what we show to the world is very different to what we're feeling internally. Again, this is a big part of reactive culture, where we don't show our emotions. Think about how that has an effect on how we do Agile. We met one Scrum Master. She was from the Philippines. And the Philippines, although it's a reactive country, has got some multi-active tendencies, one of which is they do display their emotions. So she moved to Japan and took up a job, and with her very first Scrum team, she ran the Mad, Glad, Sad retrospective. Imagine how this went down with the people that don't want to show their emotions. We have to talk about what we're mad about. So it was a complete car crash. It just didn't work at all. People just shut down, they wouldn't talk. So she realized her mistake, and her next retrospective, she did the start, stop, continue, and it worked. It was essentially the same format, but this subtle change of language completely changed the dynamic. So how we communicate has a big impact. So let's talk about that next. Communication styles. So I've talked a lot about Japan there. Let's have a look at another example. Let's go with a Finnish.
The financial crisis has, of course, had an effect across the board. Some people think even Formula One will be hit by the privations of the coming years. Let's see what former world champion Mika Hakkinen has to say about this.
Do you think that Formula One does need to look at cutting its costs? Yes. He's a racing driver, is he?
Yes, in 60 seconds.
So we can look at Mika Hakkinen there and just think he's eccentric, or think we can laugh at him. But really what we saw there was typical Finnish communication pattern. In his book, Richard D. Lewis visualizes the different communication styles in different parts of the world. So this is the Finnish one. As you can see, a really narrow word base, minimal use of speech. If there's a period of miscomprehension, then Finnish people actually use less words, they're less verbose to get clarity. So real simple structure there. Let's contrast that to something like the Spanish. So Spanish, much more complex. There's a much wider word base. The language is much more emotional, romantic even. If they hit periods of miscomprehension, they actually increase their eloquence, they increase the language used. And this continues as they build relationships, the emotional appeal to each other increases, and they get more clarity by being more verbose, by using more words, by using richer language. Let's have a look at the English one now, shall we? So you're probably familiar with this pattern. So we don't like to rock the boat. When we go into our meetings, we generally start with a few minutes of small talk. We'll casually introduce our business, almost like it's an imposition. We'll try and make our proposal sound as reasonable as possible. If we hit resistance, we keep calm. We don't react like maybe the multi-actives that get emotional. We'll keep calm. We may use coded speech, be very understated. If we can hit complete deadlock, we'll introduce humour. We'll be vague, using stalling tactics. We love to go for a break, go grab a cup of tea, come back, and then we repackage what's been talked about, make a summary of all the points that's been agreed, and then we make a decision that we're going to make a decision at the next meeting. So this is typically English communication pattern. I can see by the smirks that people have got some familiarity with this. I mentioned British coded speech there, so let's delve into that a little bit. So again, this is something very unique to British culture. So think about the impact that this has if you're not part of this culture. So we say things like, that's an interesting idea, where really you know and I know that that means, what a stupid idea, we're not going to use that. Or we say things like, we're certainly going to consider that, really means we're not going to do that. Think about a culture such as the Dutch, who are really direct. They're very literal. They say exactly what they mean. If you say to a Dutch person, we're certainly going to consider it, they take you literally. They think, great, they go away happy. So again, this subtle use of language can make a big difference in how things are understood. Again, this is just the example of the British. The Japanese have something called reading the air. And again, if you're not part of that culture, then you'll miss it. And it's very subtle about reading body language, almost like the atmosphere in the air. Like I say, if you're not part of that culture, then you won't really understand the true communication that's happening. So what we actually say, what's observable, what is explicitly being said is just the tip of the iceberg. The real meaning, the real emotions, the real feeling underneath it is underneath the surface. And if we're not aware of these cultural differences, then we can get those these misunderstandings that I talked about earlier. So how do we deal with this when we've got diverse teams? So this is becoming more and more important as our teams get more and more diverse. There's a global shortage of skills. Everywhere we went, everybody mentioned it. Everybody's looking for good people. So it means that people are looking overseas more and more. We're getting more diversity in our teams. Also, the use of distributed teams is happening more and more. I heard an interesting case study before the talk about a team member in Melbourne and another one in UK and another one in another part of the world. So we're getting more distributed teams as well. So again, starting to understand cultural differences means that we can begin to adapt to them. So why is it a good idea to do this anyway? If we begin with a very narrow spectrum of backgrounds, very narrow set of cultures in our team, we get a narrow set of views on the world, which means that we basically get a narrow set of ideas, of innovation. If we widen that spectrum, if we bring more diversity into our teams, we widen those backgrounds, we widen those potential ideas, which means we can get improved performance, we can get more innovation in our teams by embracing cultural diversity. Even embracing people that we might label as eccentric or deviant, bring them on board, make them part of the team, include them in the discussions, because again, that can widen out the innovation that can happen. There's been quite a lot of research in this area. There's been a few white papers. If we take homogeneous teams made up of a single culture as a benchmark of performance, diverse teams, when they haven't built up this empathy for each other, they haven't been coached well, the performance level has actually been proven to drop. But teams that are coached well, where they've been given time and space and some coaching to understand their differences, actually outperform homogeneous teams significantly. So we did see some multicultural teams on our travels. So we saw that, yes, those teams did have a multitude of different perspectives, different ideas, different approaches. Very stimulating interactions. We saw very healthy team discussions in a lot of situations. What's key, though, is allowing those team members to have time to adjust to each other, to understand each other, to build that empathy, to go through that period of forming. Also key is making sure that the team's goals are well defined. If you think about it, people from different backgrounds can perceive things differently. So if the goals aren't clear, then different team members will interpret them differently. So making sure that those goals are really clearly defined will help with that diverse team. It's important for any team, but with a diverse team even more so. We met one Agile team, and this is in a startup in Japan. This is actually the Scrum Master that did the Mad, Sad, Glad retro. There she is. This is a different company that she moved to. And this team is made up of people from Italy, from Spain, from the US, from Canada, as well as the Philippines and Japan. So she told us the stories. When they started, there was a lot of tension. You had some personalities that were dominating the meetings, others that were really quiet, they weren't getting involved, other ones that were getting really emotional, even maybe storming out sometimes. But she was a really skilled Scrum Master, and she did various exercises with them, different games, getting exercises for people to get to know each other. And this team actually moved to a really high-performing state. The startup has been running for 1.5 years now, and they're doing some great things. They've released some good stuff, and they're actually flying now. And a big part of that is their development team and how they've built up that strength in diversity. So what is this message? What's the message from tonight? What's my takeaways? Well, my main message is being aware of cultural differences. Different cultural behaviours can be a strength, or it can be an impediment to Agile adoption. But being aware of them and starting to manage them can help us improve our team's performance. Understanding those cultural differences and the different communication styles, again, begin to build that empathy and understanding within the team. Some cross-cultural coaching and training can help with that. On our journey, though, we were really invigorated by all of the cool stuff that we saw. We saw the mob programming in Japan. We saw a company in Buenos Aires doing holacracy. We saw companies in Colombia adopting Management 3.0. Happy Meli in Indonesia. There's lots of great stuff happening out there, and we want to encourage the global community to share ideas and learn from each other. Like I say, it really inspired us to see great Agile teams in action. So we're not academics, we're not experts, but from our travels, looking at the Lewis model as a hypothesis, seeing these different behaviours and these different adaptations in different parts of the world, we certainly think that culture does have an impact on our teams, on our Agile teams, on how we adopt Agile. So we think this is an area that needs further research and further investigation and further discussion. But the main message is adopting Agile is a culture shift in itself. It takes patience. It takes setting up the right environment, removing those cultural barriers, those corporate barriers as well. We saw teams in countries such as Philippines. We could stereotype them as, people are quiet. Yeah, it won't work there. But we saw a great example where people were given psychological safety and beginning to speak out and feel comfortable in things like retrospectives and planning sessions. So really, the message is be patient. Agile is a culture shift. It takes time, set up the right environment. But in conclusion, we do believe that Agile can work in any culture, in any part of the world. Thank you very much for listening. There's been a lot to cover in quite a short space of time. If you want to read more about our journey, we've been blogging about the visits that we've been making, the people that we met. So on our company website, redtangerine.org/blog, you can read more about our journey. Thank you for listening.